So, well, thank you all for joining this session on COVID and reproduction, and thank you very much to Christina and Kathy for organising it as well, because I think this is an important topic. The start of the pandemic, since then, it's become quite clear that COVID has an impact on all sorts of aspects of women's reproductive health, sexual activity, sexually transmitted diseases, access to healthcare, access to ART, vaccination hesitancy, all sorts of things. I think particularly interesting that the Delta variant seems to be more severe than the original variant circulating. So all these are fascinating questions too. I hope we can go into. So for those of you who aren't part of the SRA, please do join it so that you get access to all these good meetings. And I think Christine will put up the link how to do that. And we have got a lot of talks. They're going to be short, and we're going to keep to time so that Christine has got a nuclear option if you do go over, any of you. And we won't have questions until halfway through for the first set of talks, and then we'll have questions at the end for the second set of talks. So we begin with Viki Mail talking about COVID, very important topic, COVID vaccination, fertility and pregnancy. And Viki is a lecturer in reproductive immunology at Imperial College. She did a PhD in a laboratory not far from my own. And she is really the expert on this. And I'm sure you all heard her on the Today program, many other programs, and is really used by the RCOG as the oracle on this topic. So thank you very much, Viki, for agreeing to talk to us today.
I feel right at home, actually, looking at that office in which I spent so many happy hours during my PhD, which, as Ashley says, was in a lab not very far from where she sits at this moment. But I'm going to kick us off this afternoon by talking a little bit about COVID-19 vaccination, fertility and pregnancy. Now I can see from the lineup that we have quite a wide range of disciplines here, so I'm not going to go too deep into the epidemiology. In fact, I'm going to start even in the realms almost of the social sciences. But those of you who know me might wonder how I, a bench scientist focused on immune cells in the lining of the uterus, even got into this area in the first place. But what happened was this. Last December, rumours started to circulate on social media that the vaccines would cause female infertility. And these rumours originated in a blog post that proposed that the spike protein of the virus and a protein that's essential for placental function called syncytin-1 were similar enough that we might expect an antibody raised by vaccination to attack the placenta, and that would cause problems with pregnancy. And this is where I came in, because I work on immune responses to the placenta. And I thought, well, if I won't stand up and explain why this isn't true, then who will? And there were a number of reasons, even at the time, not to take these claims seriously. One, the proteins are hardly similar at all. Two, if anti-spike antibodies caused infertility, then we would expect that COVID itself would do the same. And there's no evidence that it does, at least not for female fertility. And since then, it's been definitively shown by 3 research groups that anti-spike antibodies don't cross-react with syncytin. Now, these groups did this research not because anyone really thought that the antibodies would cross-react, but specifically to counter this misinformation. But misinformation is a moving target, and a lie can get around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And once the syncytin thing had been put to bed, another claim popped up that the vaccine builds up in the ovaries and that this might therefore impact fertility. That was based on data, which I've accidentally covered up there, submitted to the Japanese regulator by Pfizer. And the regulator did approve the vaccine after seeing this data. But what someone did was to remove from the plots the trace showing that the vaccine mostly stays at the injection site. And when you look at the rest, the amount of vaccine, although it's not actually even necessarily vaccine intact, in the ovary, it looks artificially high. But if you put the injection site back in, as I have in this little riposte, you get a more representative picture. But no matter, this worries people, and I'm sure you can understand why. And today I've done a whistle-stop tour of the precise claims and why it is that they're not true. But as I talk to people, I quite quickly realise that this isn't often the best approach, partly because the mechanism by which this infertility or problems with pregnancy effect is supposedly mediated keeps changing, and partly because a lot of people haven't even been exposed to either of these specific claims. They've just heard a rumour that the vaccines cause female infertility, and they'd rather not chance it. So instead, it's better to cut out the middleman and go directly to the evidence on fertility, which we do have. So in the clinical trials, participants were asked not to become pregnant, but these were large trials and accidents happen. So some people became pregnant anyway, and they became pregnant at the same rate whether they received the vaccine or the control, which tells us that the vaccines are not reducing the likelihood of becoming pregnant. We also have some cohort studies done in IVF settings. These two looked at ovarian function and pregnancy rates in people undergoing IVF and found that they were the same in those who were vaccinated and those who were unvaccinated. Whereas these two looked at the same parameters in people before they got vaccinated and again after they got vaccinated. And again, they find no difference in any female fertility parameters. I like these studies, by the way, because they're very well controlled. We know that everyone, whether vaccinated or unvaccinated, is trying very hard to get pregnant, and they're trying in the same way. So we can easily compare rates. But in terms of people getting pregnant the conventional way, it's worth noting that we now have at least 12,000 on the record post-vax pregnancies in the USA and Canada. Although obviously this is a massive underestimate because it's only 2 countries, and even in those countries, most people's pregnancy won't find its way into the medical literature. So much for fertility. But the more I talked about this, the more pregnant people, in fact, all sorts of people very naturally asked me, well, what about people who are already pregnant? And that's a group who are understandably very concerned about what they put into their bodies because it has the potential to impact their babies, possibly for life. But pregnant people weren't included in the clinical trials. So in terms of vaccine safety, the only thing we had to go on were those accidental pregnancies and what we know in general about how the vaccines work and where it is that they end up in the body. But what we did know is that COVID in pregnancy is associated with worse outcomes. And I'm taking all these figures from this Living Systematic Review by John Allerty, which I really recommend. And it finds that pregnant people are at increased risk of needing intensive care if they get COVID, compared to those people who get COVID if they're not pregnant. But probably more worryingly, if we look at those who catch COVID in pregnancy compared to those who don't, so who are pregnant but don't get COVID, we see that they're at increased risk of preterm birth, stillbirth, and the baby needing intensive care. And with this in mind, the USA and Israel rolled out the vaccines to pregnant people at the same time they rolled them out to everyone else. And as they were doing this, they collected a lot of data on how it was going, so that if any problem emerged, they could stop the rollout. And we used that data to inform our own policies when we rolled out the vaccinations in this population starting in April. So COVID isn't safe in pregnancy. But how do we know that the vaccines are? Well, a number of ways. Most basically, pharmacovigilance schemes like the Yellow Card in the UK, VAERS in the States, and Eudravigilance in the EU solicit reports of adverse events that happen after vaccination. And none of these have detected any pattern of reports that suggests an increased risk of any pregnancy complication associated with vaccination. But these schemes aren't particularly well set up to detect a small increase in an adverse event that's quite common anyway, like, for example, miscarriage or preterm birth. So it's important that we back them up with other approaches to confirm vaccine safety. And I should say here that we do also have formal clinical trials ongoing, but in the meantime, we have 11 studies that have taken various approaches to checking vaccine safety in pregnancy. These 5 are what we would call registry studies. That's to say they take a cohort of people who get vaccinated during pregnancy and follow them up to find out what happens to them. And then they calculate the rate at which certain events, like say miscarriage or preterm birth, occur, and see if that's different from historical data, which it isn't in any of these studies. But the potential problem with this approach is that there might be other reasons that pregnancy outcomes now would be different from those in the past. The main one, of course, is the pandemic itself. So it might be nice to use approaches where we have a contemporary control group of unvaccinated people. Although, of course, that does have its own problems because people who choose not to be vaccinated might be different in all sorts of ways from those who choose to be vaccinated. But anyway, there are 2 approaches to this. These 3 case control studies each take a specific outcome and using national health data registries ask, are people who have experienced this outcome more likely to have been vaccinated than gestational age-matched people who did not experience the outcome? And using this approach, these 3 studies haven't been able to find any association between vaccination and either miscarriage or stillbirth. These 3 studies take another approach, which is to recruit a cohort of people vaccinated in pregnancy and a matched cohort that has not been vaccinated and follow them up to see what outcomes you get. This top one from Israel is actually the most interested in whether vaccines prevent people from catching COVID when they're pregnant, and they are as effective in the pregnant population as they are in the general population. And another Israeli study, which I haven't included here because it's not to do with safety, finds the same, and indeed so does this study from the USA. But also, from a safety point of view, all these studies found that the rates at which people experience various pregnancy complications was the same whether they were vaccinated or unvaccinated. So to summarize, no effect of COVID vaccination on female fertility, or indeed on male fertility, although I've not really had the time to focus on that today. But more importantly, COVID vaccination is safe in pregnancy, but COVID is not. And if you would like to find links to all of the studies that I've talked about today and more, you can find them at this URL that I've given you at the bottom. And as more studies come out, you'll also find me talking about them or tweeting about them, I suppose, on Twitter, and my handle's there. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Viki, very much for that whistle-stop tour. A huge amount of data. That's really great. And a very complex problem because, of course, people were extraordinarily worried at the time and I think didn't understand how the vaccines were so safe. So now we're going to change topic completely. And our next speaker is Dr. Pauline Tan, who's from the National University of Singapore. And she's been looking at the changes in frequency and patterns of marital sexual activity during COVID-19. Because of the worry, of course, in Singapore about the very low birth numbers, and evidence from longitudinal data prior to, during, and after the lockdown. So, Pauline Tan, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much. I am afraid I'm intruding a little bit. I'm not actually from Moffett, as pointed out. I'm actually at the National University of Singapore, and I've been looking at marital sexual activity a long time, even before COVID. And I've been following the same couples for a while, including during lockdown, after lockdown in Singapore. So maybe before I get into what I did, I could just give a quick background on Singapore. So as already mentioned by Ashley, Singapore has a really low fertility rate to the point where it's proving to be somewhat of a kind of existential threat. Our current total fertility rate is about 1.10, and that is extremely low, leading to extremely rapid demographic change. One thing that links everything up, in terms of what I just said about fertility rate and why I'm interested in this study and presenting this to you is that when asked about why, when 1,000 couples were surveyed and asked about their knowledgeability about reproductive activities and asked about their fertility ideals and progress in trying for a baby, astounding 40% of married couples said that they were not happy with their progress. And when asked why they felt that they were having trouble, a top reason cited was that there was actually low interest in sex due to long working hours and stress. And if you have ever come across OECD studies on working hours, you know that Singapore is actually a pretty big offender in terms of how long people spend it at work and how high stress levels are. So this slide is full of text. Maybe I could just point out some of the key things I want to mention, which is that in the first place, we had started to collect data from 660 heterosexual married women, and they were young, 25 to 34, the most part young. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say young. I should say the age groups at which we have the highest fertility, age-specific fertility rates. They're citizens or spouses of citizens, and they speak, write, and read English, and that was one of the inclusion criteria. We conducted in-person interview and collected a lot of baseline characteristics, and we also then asked them to follow up on 14 weeks of sex diary data, so they would give us the exact dates of sexual activity, if any. And then 500 of them consented to be followed up over the long term. And indeed, during the lockdown last year in May and post-lockdown, we continued to follow the same group of women, this 500 who consented, and we collected 1 week of sex diary data per survey. This is oversampling of, there was an oversampling of Chinese and college-educated women. In the end, we got about 409 women and about 42,000 individual days of data. So we use logistic fixed effects models with pseudo design-based sample weights to try to test for changes in frequency and patterns of marital sexual activity. So what we found was that compared to 2018, in 2020, we saw a decline, which was not really significant in the proportion of married couples who had no sex at all during the week. So we had, in some sense, an increase in how likely people were to have sex during the week. You also see an uptick in the proportion who had at least two times sex 2 times a week. And kind of interestingly, we also saw a kind of change throughout the week. So previously, on the left-hand side, in 2018, we had on the dotted line the pattern for 2018, and there we saw that there was a spike during the weekend, and that was actually something that is quite that's also replicated in other studies, that people had more sex during the weekend compared to the weekdays, and that you can see that there's a gradual increase from Monday to Thursday, and then it's kind of a taking off from Friday and Saturday. What we found was that for 2020, that just did not appear, though we had larger standard errors because of the smaller sample sizes. But even after taking into account that there was smaller sample sizes, we still found that there was a significant difference in probability of sexual activity during the weekdays. On the right-hand side, you see the same thing, but this is now for May versus June. That is to say, during the lockdown versus after the lockdown. And we found that pattern did not change even after the lockdown ended. So why it matters is, as mentioned, that in Singapore, we have low sexual frequency and satisfaction. It's about half, broadly speaking, times compared to a kind of a similar age group amount in the US. At the individual level, what we know about low sexual activity and consequences is that there is lower sexual and relationship satisfaction. There's risk of cardiovascular events in later life. And there's a list of medical conditions which I'm not qualified to talk about because I'm not really a doctor, or I am not a basic scientist. I am a social scientist. But I do believe that I do trust the medical literature that these events are associated with sexual frequency. And importantly also, of course, that low sexual frequency leads to longer waiting times to pregnancy, and that is what the newspaper was trying to pick up. The newspaper article had shown at the start. So because we have low coital frequency, we have lower probability of conception, even in fertile cycles. So we have risks of infertility, pregnancy, birth complications, birth defects due to delayed childbearing. Let me just end by saying that at the societal level, there's international evidence that birth rates are collapsing, but did find, or try to find during this, trying to investigate through the study that disruptions during the lockdown were persistent, and we found more active and flexible sexual lives for married couples, although that's just a short-term study. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. And I think we hadn't thought about that kind of aspect of the pandemic at all. So thank you for bringing it to our attention. So another group, I think, who have had difficulty in accessing reproductive care are queer and transgender people. And so it's very interesting to hear about this in more detail. And Doris Leibetseder, I hope I've said that correctly, who is in the Reproductive Sociology Research Group, but also at the University of Vienna, is going to talk to us about that. So thank you, Doris.
So these are just only preliminary thoughts for a social science project for which I didn't do any data collection yet. But yeah, so we have seen that the way in which people reproduce has changed profoundly in recent times, and that the pandemic is strongly affecting reproduction. The implications of COVID-19 have led to more challenges and exclusion of reproduction from reproduction for certain groups. So, okay, my slides. Okay, so current OECD data shows in general a declining fertility rate during the pandemic. And for example, in Germany, over 50% of people postponed having a child. Before COVID-19, the number of people seeking to reproduce using ART has risen both globally and in Europe. And yet the regulation of access to particular ART procedures in various states differs greatly, and thus also giving rise to cross-border reproductive care. So social groups particularly affected by national ART legal and medical frameworks are queer, transgender, and intersex persons, who often have to rely for these reasons on cross-border medical care. The number of LGBTIQ families is growing, but LGBTIQ reproductive and family rights are not the same everywhere, and even different across Europe. So we also have seen the 2 EU countries, actually Poland and Hungary, even curtailed LGBTIQ rights, denying LGBTIQ families and using the pandemic as an excuse to do so. Poland recently prohibited adoption for same-sex couples, and the Polish president said that the marriage is a relationship between a woman and a man. Several months later, Hungary did the same and even added an amendment to the constitution defining parenthood as the mother is a woman and the father is a man. In these cases, national biopolitical response to the pandemic activates control mechanisms that result in further threats to human rights. As the pandemic led to drastic national measures, borders were closed, and in some countries only close family members were allowed to enter the country to visit each other, and ART treatments were put on hold in many states. Racial and ethnic profiling by police and border control and the control of COVID measures in households or other indoor gatherings leads to additional challenges for migrant families and LGBTIQ people of color. In queer of color communities in particular, the police do not immediately recognize alternative family constellations, even raid their homes, and often use COVID-19 rules solely as a pretext, and these actions resulted also in more arrests more often than in a mere warning. So this is the outcome of interviews that Jin Harita-Warren was conducting in Berlin during the pandemic. For these families, it is important to have the right documentation with the correct gender terminology, above all for trans and people and same-sex parents. So in the certificates of parenthood and citizenship, here we see the further evidence that getting the right documents after the use of ART is crucial for queer and trans people, especially if they are of color or have migrated or are going to travel or want to migrate in the future. So meanwhile, in general, LGBTIQ people became even more reluctant than heterosexual people to seek healthcare due to the pandemic, and therefore the numbers of them accessing reproductive healthcare dropped. So with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, migration, cross-border reproductive care, international adoption, and ART treatments came to a halt, thus making it more difficult to reproduce and create a family. According to Koenig and Jacobson, the pandemic disruptions especially hit persons receiving treatment that involved third persons and or over which national borders had to be crossed, as is in the case of transnational surrogacy. So we all have seen the pictures, I think, in media about babies being born via international surrogacy arrangements who stranded in the country of origin, for example, in the Ukraine, at the beginning of the pandemic. Also, surrogacy is illegal in many countries. In certain cases, children born via surrogacy abroad are officially recognized. The number of children conceived through transnational surrogacy arrangements would soon outnumber those who arrived through transnational adoption in some states, as for example in Sweden. As more abuses in international adoptions are revealed, countries such as the Netherlands suspended their foreign adoption processes. If more countries follow this, fewer adoptions will happen and ART becomes even more relevant. For gay men, this, for example, poses a challenge as the only option besides international adoption, national adoptions are quite rare, so is to use actually surrogacy. So in the case of trans and intersex people, the interruption of health services is severe. Hormonal medication is crucial for most trans people and as a preparation for fertility treatments, but hospitals and clinics specialized in trans treatments had only limited access during the pandemic, and waiting times therefore have even increased. For example, the situation in Austria, as the 2020 annual review of human rights situation for LGBTIQ people reports that the only certified medical center for trans people in Eastern Austria, so Vienna, closed for 2 months and has run since then only with half the capacity since. So also intersex people are impacted by this. Okay, sorry. And as we also have seen in Sweden, a sperm shortage has caused an even longer waiting time for the use of reproductive technologies during the pandemic. Also, egg donations have declined. So they would need actually the double the amount of donations to shorten the waiting times. This makes especially waiting times longer for many lesbian couples in Sweden who already had, like in some bigger Swedish cities, waiting times for about like 1 or 2 years. So now comes my last slide. And on top of all these challenges, in general, access to ART has been restricted by medical guidelines. According to the European Society of Human Reproduction Embryology guidelines on recommencing ART treatments, patients needed to answer a triage questionnaire, and depending on their answers and COVID-19 tests, they can be excluded or the treatment can be postponed. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments afterwards.
Thank you very much, Doris, for that insight into the difficulties for this group of people. Now, we're very lucky, I think, to have actually some practicing clinicians speaking today. And the next one is Dr. Catherine Aiken, who's an academic lecturer in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynaecology here in Cambridge, and has done research on various aspects of pregnancy. And she's going to tell us today about the demand for self-managed online telemedicine abortion in 8 European countries during the COVID-19 pandemic.
So delighted to talk to you today, about some work we've been doing looking at the demand for abortion outside of the regular healthcare systems across Europe, looking particularly at the first COVID-19 lockdowns. So what we have done is we've looked at this challenge of COVID. Obviously, COVID has been an enormous challenge for all kinds of aspects of medical care. But one of the more overlooked aspects that it has really impacted is on people seeking abortions. And there have been various barriers for people themselves who are looking for abortions in terms of travel, finance, their normal social networks and people who would support them if they find themselves unexpectedly pregnant. And also for providers of abortion care. Many resources have been reallocated in health services across Europe. Staff have been redeployed, and of course, across the health service, there have been all kinds of different pathways that need to be put in place for infection control, which have limited the ability to provide medical care that you normally would. So in abortion-specific terms, the response from various European health services has been very different. In many countries, there has been a closing or very, very strict limitation of abortion services. But in other places, different strategies have been taken that have actually increased access in some ways. And a particular example of that is in Great Britain, where we moved to an entirely remote model of early medical abortion. So our key questions in this research were to really dig down in whether the demand for abortion outside of healthcare systems changed across Europe during the COVID-related lockdowns. Were people's abortion-seeking behaviours any different? And how did those correlate with what public health bodies decided to do in terms of their abortion care policies? And so to do this, we teamed up with an NGO that we've worked with before called Women on Web. Women on Web are the largest NGO who provide abortion outside of regular healthcare services. And our work with them before that we've published has shown that they provide a safe and effective service. The model is that you go online and you fill in a form, and the doctor in the Netherlands evaluates the request, gives you safety information, consent, and so on, and then sends you pills in the post, which are taken at home. And then there is online aftercare and information about how to get care in your local area as well. It mainly operates in Latin America and in other places where it's very difficult to obtain an abortion through the regular healthcare services, but it also operates in Europe, and that's the data that I'm going to talk about specifically today. We included 8 European countries in our analysis. They were picked partially on pragmatic grounds and also partially on grounds of having had interesting policies regarding abortion during the pandemic, and on access to abortion through the regular healthcare service in normal times. We used a regression discontinuity design for our analysis, so we designated a before and an after period. The before period began in January 2019, so that we had at least a year of stable baseline data unaffected by COVID to analyse for each country. And then we chose our discontinuity point at the point at which the government of each country said stay at home. And obviously different governments did that in different forms, but in our analysis, all 8 countries had a stay at home moment. Obviously that was different for each country, and we've analysed the data with respect to that. And then we designated the after period as the first lockdown, so the point at which people were told to stay at home to the first point of restriction easing. And you can see here on the graph, the black line is the cumulative requests up to the discontinuity point. The blue line is our prediction of what should have happened to cumulative requests had nothing changed after the point of lockdown. And the yellow line represents the actual number of requests that we're seeing in the after period. So in 5 of the 8 countries that we looked at, we saw a significant increase in the number of requests during the first COVID lockdowns. And that ranged from about 30% in Malta to 139% which you can see in Portugal. In 2 countries, there was absolutely no difference in requests for abortion via Women on Web in the pre and post-pandemic phases. And in 1 country, which was Great Britain, we interestingly saw 90% fewer requests than we would normally expect to see in the COVID era. And that's really interesting. I'll talk about the possible reasons for that. So obviously there's huge numbers of factors that might have influenced people's decision to seek an abortion outside the regular healthcare services during COVID. And we speculated on a large number of factors that might be associated with that. One was how bad COVID was in their country, how many people were dying, how many cases there were. We also thought it might matter whether their country was impacted by COVID early or late. The uncertainty might be different depending on whether the country was hit early or whether or not people already knew what a pandemic would bring. The stringency of lockdown and whether lockdown was early or late in each country was also something that we could evaluate. And we used data from the Oxford Epidemiological Collaborative to get these data for all of our participating countries. We also looked at finances as much as we could, and obviously different governments provided very different levels of economic support for people who were hit by the pandemic. And we know from other research that finances are quite often a major factor in whether someone will continue with a pregnancy or not. So we postulated that all of those things might influence the trends we were seeing, and we were able to find data and adjust for all of those. And interestingly, we find that actually none of those factors had any significant associations with the number of abortion requests that we were seeing outside of the healthcare system. So that was very interesting, but we could identify 2 factors that did seem to matter. One was how easy it was to access abortion and whether or not that had changed the location of abortion services, and also the stringency of travel restrictions that meant that people could get to locations where they needed to go for abortions. And in all of the 5 countries where we saw a significant increase in requests, one or other of those factors was in play. So in Hungary, Italy, and Poland, the abortion care shifted out of local clinics, family planning services, and was concentrated where it was available in big hospitals. And it's entirely possible that that was quite a frightening thing for people seeking abortion, that they would need to go at that time of immense uncertainty about what was actually happening with COVID, a long way from home, with travel restrictions, into a hospital setting. And of course, in Northern Ireland and Malta, abortion is restricted at baseline at the best of times, and there was a need for international travel there. Northern Ireland's a really interesting case because it just so happened that during the first lockdown, previously passed legislation, came into force, which meant that the NHS could provide early medical abortion where it hadn't previously been able to. And so actually the need for international travel was removed during the lockdown period. And you can see that there's actually a second discontinuity in our data at that point, which I think really demonstrates the interesting time sensitivity and the importance of availability of local services. Great Britain is the only decrease in abortion requests that we saw, and it was the only country that moved to a fully remote early medical abortion telemedicine service. And that has been a very, very interesting finding for us because as soon as that service was available to women on the NHS, there was almost a cessation of requests for the same thing via a different channel outside of the regular healthcare service. And that's particularly interesting because obviously we're evaluating a safe and effective method of accessing abortion outside of a regular healthcare service. But unfortunately, not all people who are seeking abortion do actually find those ways and may resort to other means. And so the healthcare services providing the services that people want in a safe, effective and timely way is actually a really important way of ensuring that other methods that may be less, maybe frankly dangerous, are much less likely to be used. So we've demonstrated that there's a demand for these services across Europe, and our results very much support the need for continuous remote provision of early medication abortion. They highlight the very time-sensitive nature of abortion care. It is urgent in a way that health services often don't perceive it as urgent, and the need for fully responsive changes in healthcare models that do actually meet the needs of the populations they serve. Luckily, this has generated quite a lot of interest, both in the UK and abroad, and I'm pleased to say that it has been an influential paper in the consultation about continuing this model of care outside of the acute COVID lockdowns, and that looks likely to continue in Great Britain at the moment, and I'm very pleased that this paper has been cited widely in the discussions of that. I just need to thank all my collaborators, and I think, and to you for listening. Thank you very much.
I'll now move to the second set of talks, and we can change tack completely because, of course, one of the really important questions right at the outset was whether this virus was going to cross the placenta, like, say, Zika virus turned out to do. And we can hear about looking at this in the early embryo from Bailey Weatherby, who's a PhD student in Magda Zernicke-Goetz's lab in PDN. Thank you, Bailey.
I am Bailey Weatherby. I'm a third-year PhD student with Dr. Magdalena Zernicke-Goetz at the University of Cambridge. And I'm going to talk on some of the preliminary work that we did way back in March 2020, trying to understand that really key question of if the embryo during early stages, peri-conception stages, might be vulnerable to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So my work largely focuses on the first 2 weeks following fertilization, where the single cell fertilized egg called the zygote develops after 1 week into a structure called the blastocyst, which then implants in the uterus and gives rise to a more complex structure where the early embryo consists of largely cells that will contribute to extraembryonic membranes, and as well as the embryonic tissues that are beginning to pattern themselves. And this is a very key time of development, as it's predicted up to 60% of pregnancies fail within the first 2 weeks. And most people don't know they're pregnant during that time. So the underlying things that lead to those implantation failures and complications are really not well understood. And while we've been able to study the formation of this blastocyst at the end of the first week of development since IVF was created in the 1970s, the ability to look at these peri-implantation stages only arose since 2016, when we were able for the first time to culture embryos during those stages in the lab. And that's extremely important for us in this context, given that the blastocyst at the end of that first week contacts the uterus and begins to burrow and implant as it gives rise to these more complex structures. And this outer layer of cells called the trophoectoderm will develop then into the post-implantation trophoblast and terminally differentiated syncytiotrophoblast, which interact with the blood supply and with the uterine tissue itself. And so whether those cells could be affected or receptive to infection was a key question to understand how SARS-CoV-2, if the pregnant person is infected, might actually make what is already incredibly delicate stages even more risky for early pregnancy. And just as part of the biology background, what we know about the COVID infection is that it's largely mediated by interaction with this protein called ACE2, which is then processed by another protein called TMPRSS2. And the co-expression of these two key proteins, as well as some other potential receptors, is required for the spike protein, the S protein on the virus, to be able to interact with the cell, enter it, and infect the cell. So I wanted to look at this time, published RNA sequencing data that looked at single cells of the embryos cultured from the blastocyst stage through these post-implantation stages. And I used 2 published data sets, which spanned the day 6 blastocyst all the way up to day 14. And within this, I was able to identify the key cell types that are known to exist during these times, including the epiblast, which will give rise to the whole body, the trophoblast, which is that outer layer that interacts with the uterus and the blood supply, and this and its terminally differentiated subparts, the syncytium and the EVT. And when I then looked at the expression of these key mediators of COVID infection, I did see that they were expressed particularly in the day 6 trophectoderm and a bit also in the later syncytia trophoblast, which again are those tissues that interact with the uterus. And when I look at the co-expression, I was also interested to see that they are co-expressed in these two populations to a certain extent, which suggested that it might be possible that those outer tissues were conducive to SARS-CoV-2 transfer. And while vertical transfer in later pregnancy has been shown to be incredibly rare, again, these early stages where the embryo is just starting to pattern itself and we don't know much about could be a whole other story. And so this raised a lot more questions than answers because this was just looking at RNA expression, but the functional component of all of this is going to be the protein. And more recently, some studies have come out that did indeed confirm that in the trophectoderm, we did have expression of both of these key components at the protein level. And when they used the spike protein to see if viruses with the COVID spike protein could infect these cells, they did see successful infection, which does suggest that this blastocyst trophectoderm is indeed susceptible to COVID infection. And we have seen some examples of placentas that did test positive and some early abortions that happened in which the fetal tissue itself did test positive. So it seems like this could be possible, and the early risks at these peri-implantation stages might play a role. But we still have to study this further to really understand how risky it may be. And one of the things that still hasn't been done is actually looking at the implantation window itself. And so this again is a potential application of the culture system that we use that we might be interested in looking at how embryos exposed to the spike protein and how the more post-implantation tissues are patterned following that type of infection. And more recently, there's been some efforts using human stem cells to create models of human embryos, which could be extremely useful for this type of work. But again, this hasn't been done yet, and it's something that I think for both the SARS-CoV-2 virus and other viruses could be incredibly useful for us to understand what are the true risks at the early embryo stages. And yeah, that's all from me.
Really keeping on the same theme of what happens and how does it get across to the baby, we're fortunate to have an actual pediatrician to talk to us about this. So thank you, Thomas, very much for telling us about what happens in the fetus should we be worried.
I'm an neonatologist. I work at the Rosie, and my main job is actually looking at functional brain imaging in the newborn. And I'm going to take you through a sort of thought experiment we kind of did back last March as the virus sort of spread, asking, should the fetus, should the newborn infant be worried, or should we worry about them as the pandemic spread? And the reason Emily put just beforehand was the knowledge of the last pandemic of the Zika virus and how that really devastated newborn infants, and to think, well, is there something that could play out in a very bad way to newborn infants? And the reason I got interested in this was actually because as we all suddenly went online, we were supervising a couple of medical students, my colleague Kathy Bidsell and Hilary Wong, and trying to think of, what projects could they do remotely. And it was to sort of review what is the evidence of fetal infection in terms of coronaviruses. Should this be a worry? And I was very pleased that Aisha Iqbal, one of our medical students, published this paper in Acta Pediatrica as a sort of review prior to a lot of the data, which a lot of it's been presented today, was published. In fact, one of the first papers back in March was a retrospective study of around 9 pregnant women, showing actually very little in the way of sort of vertical transmission. Since then, I think of the 317,000 papers now on COVID-19, more than 2,500 when I looked this morning are on reproduction and neonatal issues. So I have no intention of giving you a sort of complete review of all the literature, but the way we thought about this problem was one directly on the fetus in terms of infection from the mother, either vertically or horizontally, but also the impacts of lockdown in terms of access to healthcare, the social issues around the household, and the sort of effects of social restriction and what that may have on the fetus. So again, take us back to last March when very little was known about it. Why, in theory, should the fetus be worried? Well, there are a number of viral infections which exist, which produce devastating congenital infections, rubella, parvovirus, CMV, and as I mentioned, Zika, and also through horizontal infection at time of birth, HIV, hepatitis, and herpes. Not just vertical and horizontal infection, but morbidity to the mother. It was also something which we thought would be important. And looking back in the literature, pneumonia is always associated with increased hospitalization and death in pregnant women. The Asian flu pandemic back in the 1950s, there was a much higher case fatality rate in pregnant women. Generally, influenza is associated with stillbirth, preterm birth, and growth retardation. And although the SARS and MERS outbreaks were much smaller compared to COVID, there is some publication suggesting worse outcomes for mothers and their babies. But conversely, maybe the fetus should not be worried, and I'm very aware that I'm very ignorant in this group on the whole sort of feto-placental unit, but it is a very strong barrier protecting the developing embryo and fetus from the outside world, and has a very sophisticated immune system. And as touched on right at the beginning and in our previous talk, there may be susceptibility, but there's also a strong protection from viral infections. And if we look at generally viruses in humans, apparently there are 10 to the 31 viruses existing on our planet. We live in a viral planet. 320,000 exist in mammals, about 200 will cause human diseases, but only 12 actually cause serious disease in the unborn baby. So the stakes are actually in favor of the fetus and the neonate to be protected. And it does seem to have sort of been borne out over the year that the real problem is infection in the mother and the morbidity associated with the mother. And I literally changed my slide after Viki's first talk, going back to this paper, demonstrating that pregnant women are much more likely to need intensive care with the sort of standard pre-existing morbidities, and they're more likely to deliver early, and those babies are more likely to end up in neonatal intensive care. So it's the consequences of the mother being unwell rather than a congenital infection per se. Interestingly, the high-income countries fare better than low-income countries across both maternal and neonatal morbidity. And it was interesting from my own personal experience in the first and second waves here at the Rosie Hospital, we were relatively spared from the medical consequences of SARS in terms of infected mothers and particularly infected babies. But over this summer, we've seen a lot more mothers who've been seriously ill in intensive care, requiring early delivery of their babies and the subsequent morbidity of very preterm infants, and sadly mortality of some of the mothers. The data out there for either vertical or horizontal transmission causing serious illness in the newborn is very sparse, and so most of the babies who are born, even if they are positive, actually do very well. So as well as looking at what happens to the fetus, we can look at the consequences of what lockdown would do in terms of the health and well-being of pregnant women. And they are the most sort of vulnerable people in society, especially when they lose work or there's reduced family income, and that will lead to sort of poor outcomes for mothers and babies. Very early on in the first lockdown, there was quite frightening sort of data showing that there was an increase in domestic abuse. There were 16 killings related to domestic abuse in the first 3 weeks of lockdown, 3 times as many that you'd expect in previous years. And globally, the women seem to be at the sort of bottom rung in sort of the people who would be looked after. There were reports of partners not being allowed to be present during birth, that pregnant women and families had to sort of purchase PPE in order to enter the hospitals. There were far more reports of interventions in childbirth to avoid, in some cases, epidurals to avoid emergency cesarean sections, or conversely, cesarean sections without any medical indication in some instances. And separation of mother and baby, despite the WHO guidelines. Many women who were positive were quarantined from their babies for 14 days. In Romania, babies were removed from their mothers regardless of the COVID status, and reports of the infants actually becoming infected with COVID from the healthcare staff. So all this has the consequence of affecting the mother and her own mental well-being. And so that leads to the final sort of thought that the effect of stress on the mother will actually impact on the brain development of the newborn. And so I'll sort of end with a really busy slide, but essentially this is describing how the stress in the mother actually has a biological plausibility in terms of brain development in the fetus, which could have much longer implications. And I'll use that as a sort of segue to the sort of final talk of today, where Stacey Weiss will talk about the Cocoa Pip study, which I have been involved in, looking at COVID-19 in the context of pregnancy, infancy, and parenting. So thanks very much to the medical students for sort of inspiring me to think sort of a bit more laterally than what I normally do. And hopefully I can take some questions right at the end.
So the next talk we have is about another way of looking after people remotely, and this time looking after delivering antenatal care remotely. And this is Carolina and Lisa Hinton from the THIS of this institute. I don't know how you're both going to talk. Are you talking half and half, or whenever you're talking, but I'll leave it to you to work that out. Thank you very much.
We're going to do it half and half, and then we're going to do a bit of a Chris Whitty next slide, please, at the end. So Carolina's going to kick us off. Thank you.
This is a talk about a study that looks at remote antenatal care that intensified during the pandemic, but we're trying to learn beyond that. So we all know that about 750,000 pregnant people use antenatal care every year in the UK. And as the pandemic started, and antenatal care involves a series of tests and some antenatal consultations. And when the pandemic started, there was a need to take steps to lower transmission of the virus, and that was interpreted by the Royal Colleges as the necessity to avoid in-person consultations. And the recommendation that was published in guidelines that consultations, if possible, should take place remotely. As a result, in the first months of the pandemic, about 80% of all antenatal consultations took place remotely. And even though that shift was understandable, it was also clear that there wasn't a solid evidence base to really justify this change. And this is what the study is about. We wanted to understand what the best practice for antenatal care is. We wanted to understand from stakeholders what works well and why not, perhaps, in remote antenatal care, to produce a consensus on what good looks like in remote antenatal care, and also produce enduring learning for the future, because we understand that there is appetite for incorporating remote consultations in antenatal care pathways beyond the pandemic, because I think we all hope that it will end one day. So in this particular study, we involved pregnant people and birth partners, healthcare professionals who provided maternity care, but also managers and system level stakeholders, so people who actually organize the delivery of antenatal care. We wanted to understand all the perspectives to actually get a better understanding. Because the study was conducted during the pandemic, we mostly used online methods. So in addition to a review of literature on remote care and the use of remote consultations in maternity care, we also conducted a survey, and we did semi-structured interviews. And for the beginning of next year, we also have a preference study planned. We conducted the survey and the interviews via a discovery platform, which is a citizen science platform that was developed for this institute. And we were also very aware of the fact that because we're using online methods, there is a possibility that they will exclude certain people who don't have access to online methods. So we consulted an expert collaborative group that has 13 members on ways of including people who we could miss out if we only use online methods. So we also worked with community groups and health advocates to to increase diversity of our sample. Oh no, sorry. And in the survey, we had about 143 responses. Half of them were from people who are either currently or recently pregnant. So there are people who are pregnant, who gave birth since March 2020, or were pregnant during the time when they took the survey. And we also received responses from 54 healthcare professionals and 14 managers. We had a good diversity breakdown. So we had 13 responses out of 75 from recently or currently pregnant people, and about the same amount from healthcare professionals and managers. In the interviews, we did the interviews either via telephone or via an online platform. We conducted 92 interviews, and we are currently kind of working through the analysis, and we interviewed almost 50 pregnant people and their families, mostly pregnant people. There weren't a lot of partners who were interviewed, and 31 healthcare professionals and 14 managers and system level stakeholders. So we have a really rich data set that we are now working through. And Lisa is going to tell you what we've learned.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm just going to give you a very quick flavour of some of the findings from our initial analysis. I know we're pressed for time. But firstly, what we heard from women and birth partners from the free text tense responses and the interviews that we conducted. There was much that worked very well in remote antenatal care and that they were really positive about. In particular, they drew attention to the fact that undertaking care remotely can be safe, particularly protecting from infection. It also allowed for partners to be included in those consultations. As you will all be aware, partners were not allowed to go into hospital and attend antenatal appointments that were taking place face-to-face last year because of the pandemic. So that was another plus. But perhaps the most prominent feature for the positive aspects was that remote consultations are convenient. They're easier to fit around work. It's not necessary to book time off work or arrange childcare or things like that. But next slide, please, Carolina. There's much for women and their partners that wasn't working in remote care. They particularly drew attention to how they felt additionally isolated when they were only having their consultations with their midwives or doctors over the telephone or video consultation. And they struggled with raising issues around mental health and felt that it was much harder to raise some of those softer, less clinical components of care when they weren't able to meet people face to face. And crucially, they found that it was harder to build rapport with their health professionals and difficult to develop a relationship when they only met people remotely. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we've heard from health professionals, next slide, it's also, there's been lots that has been very positive, and what works well for health professionals is the flexibility that remote consultations allow, that they allow healthcare professionals to bridge gaps between face-to-face appointments, and clinics that are run remotely can be more efficient. And they felt that remote consultations could be empowering for women and encourage women to get much more involved in their own care and their own self-care during pregnancy. Next slide, please. But there was also plenty that wasn't working well for healthcare professionals. They also highlighted the increased feelings of isolation that they observed in women. They raised practical IT barriers and practical barriers around integration of electronic healthcare records. And they too raised the impact that remote consultations had on developing care relationships. Next slide, please, Carolina. But most importantly, the theme that came out of the interviews that we did with healthcare professionals and system level stakeholders was their concerns that remote consultations could further amplify well-known existing inequalities and unequal outcomes in maternity care. Next slide, please. And these are not just in one or two groups in our society, but this here is a summary of all of the groups that were mentioned in interviews where health professionals were worried that some of these groups would be further disadvantaged by remote care. So next slide, please, Carolina, just to finish up. What do we do with this learning as we think about what maternity care might look like post-pandemic? As Caroline has already alluded to, there's a social and a policy appetite to lock in the digital transformations of the last 18 months. And indeed, there's plenty that's worth keeping hold of, and our findings suggest that there's many jewels that we should really try and retain as we move beyond the pandemic. But our findings also suggest that we need to approach remote consultations in maternity care cautiously, and that one of the unseen consequences for patients and the staff is that their relationships are impacted and that there are concerns that some might be risk being left behind. We've used our analysis to develop a quality framework that we are proposing might be a very useful guide for thinking about how we might structure care in a post-pandemic world, and structure our thinking about the extent to which we might or might not want to integrate remote provision into antenatal care pathways going forwards. Next slide, please, Carolina. I just wanted to thank the many groups that supported us in our data collection, our research, and say thank you very much for listening.
The next talk is again from the Rosie Hospital, and Amy Sutton-Cole, who's the lead research midwife on the POP study run by Gordon Smith, is going to talk about recruiting to the POP study during the pandemic and how they adapted this very important study to do that. Thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you, Ashley. So yes, as Ashley's mentioned, I'm Amy Sutton-Cole, and I'm going to be talking about recruiting to a clinical research study during a global pandemic, specifically the POPs2 study. So a quick overview of the study. The Pregnancy Outcome Prediction Study 2 follows on from the Pregnancy Outcome Prediction Study that ran at the Rosie Hospital between 2007 and 2013. And the second study opened to recruitment at the Rosie on the 13th of January 2020, so just 2 months before the UK went into the first lockdown. The study comprises of a nested randomised controlled trial within a cohort study of nulliparous women with singleton pregnancies. And our aim is to determine whether screening using a method tested in the original POP study for assessing the risk of preeclampsia or growth restriction at term correctly identifies women at increased risk of complications of those conditions, and whether induction of labour for women who do screen high risk improves outcome for both mother and baby. And the design of our study combined elements of routine clinical care with our trial procedures for ease of our participants. But of course, when the pandemic hit, it meant it wasn't so easy to stop the study completely. So our aim was to recruit about 80 to 100 women a month to the cohort study, with the hope that just over 75% of women would be eligible and wish to take part in the RCT when they reach 36 weeks. So we provide information on the study to women in their appointment letter for their 12-week scan at the Rosie. So when they come for their scan, the sonographer is able to ask them if they've had a think about taking part, and then we can sign them up after their scan. We book them an anomaly scan with ourselves and take the first blood sample for our study, along with any clinically indicated bloods, so they're booking bloods, their combined screening. The anomaly scan appointment combines the routine NHS 20-week scan with additional scanning time for our research measurements, a second blood test, and we recruit fathers for a DNA sample at that point as well. Then we have 2 blinded growth scans at 28 weeks and 36 weeks. Again, research blood samples are taken, and at 28 weeks we take the routine 28-week samples alongside our research sample and provide women with an information leaflet on the randomised controlled trial. Then at 36 weeks, women are able to speak to a midwife after they have had their scan if they're interested in participating in the RCT. So we hope to recruit 4,500 women to the cohort study, and that will mean around 3,600 are interested in taking part in the RCT. A majority of those women will then screen low risk for preeclampsia and fetal growth restriction. And we expect around 250 women to screen high risk, and they will be randomized 50-50 to routine care and being blinded to that result, and 50% to an intervention, namely induction of labour. So that was how it was supposed to go, but the reality was that we opened the study, as I mentioned, on the 13th of January, and we wanted to have a little bit of a slower start initially with recruitment. So we decided not to go for our 80 to 100 straight away, because we wanted to stagger the staffing and make sure that we were doing each time point well before we open the next time point. And we were actually turning women away because there are only so many scan slots per due date, and women really wanted to take part in the study. It was very popular. So we reached 100 participants on March 2nd, and we're feeling very pleased with ourselves, only for things to change dramatically by March 17th, when it was very clear that there was going to be a lockdown. And so we had to pause recruitment on that day. We had already recruited by March 17th 134 women who were expecting a POPS2 research scan at 20 weeks. And as I mentioned, that also included their NHS routine scan. And the ultrasound department, as all NHS ultrasound departments are, were very busy and faced with the prospect of staff going off sick, so did not have the capacity to absorb those 134 women back for hour-long anomaly scan appointments. As you can see in the photograph, our scan rooms for POPS2 are individual ensuite rooms with piped oxygen. So we also had an issue that the trust wanted the rooms back that we use in the clinical research facility for our scans, but we still had to try and scan 134 women. And very kindly, the fetal medicine department in the Rosie Hospital allowed us to use one of their rooms and gave us a private waiting room so that we could maintain social distancing for our participants and carry on with those 134 anomaly scans at 20 weeks. Due to the visiting restrictions for partners, we weren't able to recruit fathers at that appointment, because the laboratory technicians working for POPS were not considered essential on-site staff at that time. We were also unable to take the blood samples as expected at the 20-week appointments. So we lost an awful lot of data, and we had to apologise to those participants that it was very unlikely we would be able to honour their 28 and 36-week appointments, but we would be in touch if anything changed. So once we'd finished with those 134 participants, we essentially paused the study completely. And we worked hard on thinking of how we could reopen safely. And in July, we had an outdoor, because we couldn't all meet indoors at that time, training session for staff to return to work. Some had been working elsewhere in the hospital during that lockdown. Some had chosen that there were bank staff had chosen not to come into work. So we had sessions on returning to work in the hospital and how we were going to open POPS2 safely. And on August 3rd, we recommenced recruitment. So to do that, we had created this rather homely recruitment room in the ultrasound department. We had to strip that back, rearrange the furniture so that we could stay socially distanced to participants, and to reduce the number of people waiting in the ultrasound department waiting room, we had to employ some more staff and split that first recruitment visit so that we just consented participants in the ultrasound department, and then they went up to the clinical research facility for all their visit one procedures, such as blood pressure and our data collection. So it did require double the staff for that visit that we had previously anticipated. Of course, we had to all start wearing PPE, and again, it required more staffing because we had to phone every participant before they came in for their scans to do a COVID screen as part of trust rules. Recruitment went really well in August, September and October, and we were recruiting between 60 and 70 participants. But then the firebreak lockdown came in November, and women did not want to sign up. So we'd gone from turning women away to many women saying, no, I do not want to sign up to a study where I have additional visits to the hospital. And we only recruited 40 participants in November. just on December 19th, the government announced the tier system. And because of our bordering counties were all put into tier 4 on December 19th, we had to quickly assess which of our participants were coming from where, and send out PCR packs to anybody that had appointments around Christmas who were living in tier 4, and let them know that they would not be able to come into the hospital for that appointment without a negative PCR result. The situation then quickly changed, and by Boxing Day, Cambridgeshire was also in tier 4, so anybody could come into the hospital. But again, we were asked to leave the clinical research facility, and we were back in fetal medicine for a little while, trying to run the study between another part of the research facility, because by this point we'd booked so many scans that we needed 2 scan rooms running, and fetal medicine only had 1 they could give us. So we moved to a smaller area in the research facility, and for 1 scan room and 1 scan room in the Rosie, and had to run between the 2. We also had to put in protocol amendments because the trust issued an order that no non-essential face-to-face appointments were to go ahead. And during the first lockdown, when research was stopped, we were covered. But as research could continue, but it was a trust directive that stopped us doing the 28 and 36-week appointments, we had to add the words "where possible" to our protocol relating to our 28 and 36-week appointments and blood samples. So lots of data was being missed when we had to cancel those appointments over winter. Again, because of the lockdown, we only recruited 27 women in the January of 2021, and so we introduced telephone consenting with a hope that we could boost recruitment, because we hoped that women would feel they had to attend for a 20-week scan anyway. So in 8 weeks' time, we hope the lockdown would make the situation improve, and that certainly by 16 weeks on from that point, when they would be due their 28-week appointment, the situation would be drastically improved, and that hopefully they would be happy to come into the hospital at that point. And it did work. So we upped our numbers to 45 recruits by February with the addition of telephone consenting. And things did improve. So by late February, visiting restrictions were eased, and so we were able to go with our randomized controlled trial from March the 3rd and start recruiting to that part of the study and open all time points. So I think one of our biggest challenges was trying to bring a team together, engage the clinical services who we needed to collect placentas for the study, to approach participants for the study. And so we've had to come up with lots of inventive ways of outdoor sessions, Zoom, fundraising walks where we could meet up to newsletters, so that we can try and bring those teams together and work collaboratively. So I just want to say thank you to the wider team and everybody that helped us continue and carry on and make POPs a success despite all those challenges of the last 18 months.
Thank you very much for telling us all about the hazards you've been through. It's very impressive how you've managed to keep going. So our last talk this afternoon is from Dr. Stacey Meredith Weiss from the Psychology Department, who's looked at an interesting question about actually what happens to babies during this period when we all had very limited social interactions. I'm sure what happens to old people is also quite interesting, what happened during that period. So thank you very much, Stacey.
My name is Stacey Weiss. Thank you all for the lovely talks, thinking from conception onwards about the pandemic. It's been very reflective. So I'm a research associate in the Department of Psychology, and I will talk today about a large longitudinal study that we conducted in light of COVID-19. We were expecting to do a study that was going to look at ultrasounds and follow up on infant neuroimaging, and adapted instead of studying context in early pregnancy and childhood and how those related to neuroimaging, to understand how COVID as a context changed pregnancy, infancy, and parenting experiences. So I just added this in after hearing Amy's talk because we can relate. So this is just a brief and too busy reminder of what the last year has been, from lockdown 1 initially to the introduction of face masks, to again the reopening in summer of last year, to this time last year we were amidst lockdown 2, to the introduction of the tier system before the most of the country went into significant lockdown for a period of several months, again during lockdown 3, and then the easing of restrictions in April of last year, which marks when we, for this subsample of a larger study, and took our last baby for a study of how parents reported the physical and psychological changes occurring to them and their babies. The study follows babies from mothers from their 20-week visits and asks about their mental state, their health, their social interactions, their COVID attitudes. Sorry, my neighbor has a baby. I don't know if you can hear it. But we also followed up a series of questions, and parents could intake at any time from the time they were 20 weeks expecting to the time they were their baby was 9 months of age. So we targeted questionnaires to have parents report their child's development, their temperament, how they were interacting with the healthcare system, both during pregnancy and after birth, and also to report facets of their infant's development. How well did they respond to people, faces, voices? How was their mood? How was their ability to soothe themselves? Those are the kinds of questions that we're going to be looking at and talking about a little bit today. I also just wanted to say, I'm part of a very big team of incredible researchers, including Toppin, who presented earlier, and worked in all throughout COVID hospital. I'm Sarah Lloyd Fox, Mark Johnson, and I created the survey in collaboration with my colleague Ezra before we had met over Zoom. So we enrolled over 2,000 families from a wide range of backgrounds, and this is just the subsample that participated in the United Kingdom. So we actually had something like 2,600 families from across the globe, but just while we're talking about lockdown, to have a more uniform, cohesive sample, I'll just focus on the subset of families mentioned who had the highest quality data and also were parents at this stage. What we're trying to do, and in following up these participants now, is link the babies who were conceived during the pandemic and follow up on how they're doing now. So this is a sample of 1,000 participants, and data was collected. Babies could be born anytime from November 2019 to present to July 2021, Freedom Day, July 19th. We have a pretty diverse range of families that participated in our study. It's fairly representative of the UK via ethnicity, and a little bit above average via household income. And also just to say, we have several different stages of babies, of parents who reported on their babies of different ages. Newborns would be under 2 months. It's a fairly even split across those age ranges that you see there. We also reported relatively few parents reported having COVID themselves, and this is mostly a sample of mothers. So relatively few mothers reported having COVID, but there is a significant number in the sample who had it in their household, particularly reporting that their partners had it. So here today, I will discuss how babies in lockdown differed in their social sensitivity as a function of their interactions with either their caregivers or others, anyone outside the house. It's commonly said it takes a village to raise a baby, but the pandemic restrictions meant that people didn't have access to the kind of social support that they might expect, whether it was their own parents additional caregivers to help with work, family, friends coming around, and even just the casual acquaintances that you're excited to show your baby to. We did both qualitative and quantitative study questions here, and parents seem to really miss both kinds, the warm, involved support and also just the casual showing off of their baby. So I think that's an interesting perspective too. So we first asked whether government restrictions during the baby's birth impacted how much social exposure the baby had to others outside their household. And then I'll address how these government restrictions impacted parents' own interactions with their babies, face-to-face, these kind of high quality, engaging interactions that we think of as very important for allowing infants to pick up on social cues and develop their skills. Finally, I'll ask whether if a parent reported measures of their infant's social development, like how likely the baby was to respond to voices, cuddles, or faces, differed as a function of their social exposure and the timing of their birth. So this is just a wide array of some of the measures used in the study. So these all went into a structural equation model, and I'll talk us through the outcomes here, but just to say anything bolded came up as significant, but the primary ones are the ones that are in color. So we found initially that in the first months, babies born during lockdown or restrictions had fewer social interactions. So this just tells us that parents seem to comply with the guidelines. So you can see in red, yellow, and green, parents had reduced social interactions, reported that their baby met fewer people compared to pre-pandemic. Regional restrictions were somewhere kind of in the middle, and some are reopening that window of last summer from June to September was more normal. Interestingly, during lockdown 1, parents played face-to-face as often with their babies as they did pre-pandemic, which is pictured in pink. And it seems like almost as if to compensate for the lack of other social interactions, parents reported more of this kind of high quality face-to-face interaction with their babies in lockdown 2, during social restrictions, and during lockdown 3. So parents may have either had more time or sensed that their baby would benefit from their input and seemingly adapted accordingly. Finally, parents reported that their baby was less responsive to some kinds of social stimuli, but this association was partially mediated by the cumulative influence of their own quality of interactions, that being the parents' interactions, and how much social exposure they had to others. So when you add up the exposure from other interactions and parents' interactions, and you also account for a wide range of variables, and I'll pop them back up again at the end, including the baby's age, parents' stress, social economic status, and also whether it was COVID in their household. It seems like these important early social interactions remain significant. So parents largely complied with government guidelines, probably not terribly surprising. And so babies did have less social exposure during the lockdowns, all 3 of them. That said, especially during lockdown 2 and 3, it seems like there was even more high quality face-to-face interactions that parents engaged in with their babies compared to pre-pandemic, and no difference for lockdown 1. And finally, babies born in lockdown 2 and 3 and throughout the fluctuations of regional restrictions had lower social exposure, but these interactions with other people, their parents and others in their community, seem to mediate this effect somewhat. This is just a quote from one parent who said, in light of parenting during the pandemic, she appreciated the quality, uninterrupted bonding time with her baby without distractions. Just some quick takeaways. Although parenting takes a village, and we all know the role of alloparents in social support in those early sensitive period of the transition to parenting makes a huge difference. seems like parents are able to adapt their sensitivity to their babies, even in the absence of those kind of broad social supports. That said, it seems even from our study that existing disparities were exacerbated. And this highlights the fact that some families lack social support even pre-pandemic. So it kind of put everyone on a more even playing ground where now everyone was experiencing that kind of lack of social support that should be addressed, as this vulnerable time for parents benefits from support to enable parents to have the time to enjoy and marvel in interactions with their babies. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all the speakers very much indeed. Christina for managing the whole technological side of this, and Kathy for her support as the director of the SRI, and thank you very much for listening. So thank you.